Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, The Next Big Thing in MarTech, the Data Warehouse, presented by Hightouch and MarTech. Before we begin, just a few viewing tips for you. If you have any audio issues, click the audio icon on your screen to enable your audio. And if you have any viewing issues, you can use the Q&A section at any time to communicate with us. You can send questions and comments via the Q&A directly to our speakers as well. So let's get to our presentation. Joining us today is Tejas Manohar, co-founder and co-CEO of Hightouch, Scott Brinker, founder of Chief MarTech, and Juan Mendoza, CEO of the MarTech Weekly. Thank you all for joining us today. I will turn things over to you now.
Want to start off with some quick introductions, actually. Scott, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, yeah, as noted, I'm the founder, editor of the blog, Chief MarTech. So for 15 years, I've been studying the rise, in fact, the very large rise of all things marketing technology. And then I also am the VP of Platform Ecosystem at HubSpot.
Nice. Juan, up next.
Well, hello. I should say good morning. It's very early in the morning here. My name is Juan Mendoza. I'm based actually in Melbourne, Australia, on the other side of the world, as to our other two distinguished guests this morning. But so I am the CEO of the MarTech Weekly. We're a media company. We do research into the marketing technology space. We both do podcasts and newsletters, and we also do community around the marketing technology world. I also host Making Sense of MarTech. That's a regular podcast that tracks the industry across a wide set of topics. And also Scott and I, we actually run a show called Big MarTech as well. We've actually just launched that, which is we launched just season 2, which is great. And you can catch it every week at bigmartech.com.
Amazing. We have the father of MarTech here, Scott, and the legend, the rising legend of MarTech here, Juan, to join us today. And then I'll introduce myself. I'm Tejas, co-founder and co-CEO over here at Hightouch. Hightouch is what we call a data activation platform. Basically, we help companies and marketing teams and digital teams and growth teams leverage all the data inside of their data warehouses, databases, data lakes, etc., to kind of drive growth and drive personalization on email, ads, all the different marketing systems that are being used across the company. And before founding Hightouch, I was actually an early engineer at Segment about 7-8 years ago, and kind of helped create the CDP space there. So excited to chat a bit about that today. So before we get too far in and before we get into the fireside chat, wanted to set some context on what we're talking about, both on the MarTech space as well as how it's changing with the data warehouse and the rise of cloud data warehouses. So why don't we start off with you, Scott, and tell us a bit about, how MarTech has evolved over the last decade plus that you've been analyzing it.
Yeah, I suspect a number of our audience members here have seen some version of this graphic at one point or another. It might very well be the bane of their existence at different times. But yeah, I mean, the short version of this narrative is, marketing technology over the past decade has gone from what was a rich field of several hundred companies to just an insanely diversified field of thousands and thousands of companies. The count we had last year was just shy of 10,000. We're coming out with the latest one here in, just about a month. Spoiler alert, it has not shrunk dramatically. So if you were betting money on it shrinking dramatically, you might want to find a way to hedge that bet. And again, it's not to say that there isn't consolidation that keeps happening in this industry. There constantly is. It's just the forces that continue to inspire new specializations or new disruptions or new emerging technology just continues, at an incredible rate. And so if we try and zoom in on this, so this is the eye test, right? Like, can you identify the third icon in the fourth column from, all right, not really going to do that to you. I think the thing I would to set up where we're going to be talking is every single one of these dots represents a solution in the market the companies are deploying, they're using inside their marketing tech stack. each one of these dots is also something that is generating data. And each one of these dots is something that is hungry to absorb more data, you know? And so when we think about like, yeah, this incredible growth of the marketing technology landscape, I mean, again, when you actually do the calculation, I'm like, my goodness, like over 6,000% growth. This is also a 6,000% growth in the universe of data that is being collected and the universe of data, you know, that we want to be able to consume and leverage. And that puts us in a really interesting place, doesn't it, my friend?
It does. So I'll talk a bit about the data side of the equation. Whenever I explain what Hightouch does, or maybe not as much these days, but in the early days of the company, I really remember when I explained to people, well, we're going to be turning the data warehouse into this live source of data that you can use for personalization, you can use for campaigns, you can use it as your growth engine. People would always ask me, like, the data warehouse, like, why are we using that, you know, thing over in the corner that's powering my Tableau report that takes forever to load and, you know, IT owns as a source of truth and the home for actionable live marketing data. And that's where this comes in. So, you know, data warehouses have been around for a long time now. We certainly didn't invent the data warehouse here at Hightouch, but neither did our friends at, you know, Snowflake or Google Cloud or AWS. The data warehouse has been here for almost 30, 40 years and was kind of the first source of data that originated to help companies get all their information from everywhere: marketing, sales, finance, offline data, online data, into one source of truth. And the data warehouse has actually changed a lot over the last decade, which is something that I wanted to touch on and kind of how that impacts how marketing and digital teams think about the data warehouse. So, you know, old data warehouses were slow. They look something like that car that we have over here in the image. They were hard to get data into. An IT team at your company had to scale it up and down based on your query workload. Maybe they would ask you tomorrow to get a refreshed answer about it. But that space has changed dramatically over the last 10 years. And it's actually interesting, you know, we won't get into all the details here, but it really started with an innovation in hardware, actually, where storing data became so much cheaper about 10 years ago with the invention of the SSD, actually. And that allowed the clouds to create these cloud data warehouses, which make it super cheap, super easy to put all your data from all parts of the business, whether it's every event a user's doing on their website, to every checkout in a store, to, you know, every email open event coming out of a MarTech system, into this data warehouse that can be used not only for analytics, but what we'll start to talk about is how it can be used for activation as well. So I think we went something from Juan's old car over here to Juan's new car over here with cloud data warehouses. And basically, though, what we see across the board is, you know, most organizations across the board, even though the data warehouse has become so much more powerful over the last decade, they're still using it for the same purpose, which is that BI line coming out of the data warehouse. You know, they're using it for Tableau, using it for reporting on board meetings, using it for Microsoft Power BI. And what we are starting to, you know, make popular across all industries really is this idea of using the data warehouse as the central source of truth for your business. If it's already the place that you're answering all your questions, if it's already the place you're relying on for reporting and insights, if it's already the place where all the data is, why not actually leverage it to power personalization, to power experimentation, to power audiences across all the different marketing systems and advertising systems at a company. And that's kind of what we're doing here at Hightouch. And, you know, the reason we took this approach is because we saw it was an approach that leading organizations were taking with, you know, building their pipelines internally. Everyone kind of, all roads sort of led to the data warehouse eventually. People tried using other solutions like CDPs as the source of truth, but eventually the data warehouse was the place where all the information resided. And we wanted to really bring that and make it accessible to the rest of the world with Hightouch Customer Studio. So before we go on to the fireside chat, wanted to let Juan round it out to chat a bit about how the investment in data has been changing from a marketing perspective.
Oh, thank you, Tejas. Yeah, so I think it's really interesting to see this evolution, as you mentioned, Tejas, about how the data warehouse has become much more cheaper to use and much more accessible to use for businesses. And almost anyone can spin up an AWS instance or a Snowflake instance these days. It's more accessible, it's cheaper, and then it's also becoming more capable as well. And that's what I'm seeing as well. So there's two big charts that I point everyone to when I think about this category of data activation, composable CDP. The left-hand chart is all about CMO budgets. And all of those bars in the orange are all of the different types of investments from the CMO's angle into data-intensive activities. So from everything from market insights and analytics to customer data and marketing data and analytics through to customer insights as well. There's so much investment into just the data space from the CMO perspective. And by the way, this is the CMO's budget. It's not the CTO's budget, or it's not the data analytics budget. This is the CMO's budget, the Chief Marketing Officer's budget. So this fantastic report from the CMO spend from Gartner in 2022 points in this direction of there is increasing investment from the marketing department on data intensive activities. But if you look on the chart on the right, this is a very different story. This is looking at the total revenue growth of a breakout data warehousing company called Snowflake. You may have heard of it. It IPO'd, I think, about 2 years ago. But as you can see there in the purpley color, purpley, tealy type color, we've got Snowflake's annual revenue. And that's just been on an ongoing stream of growth, to $1.2 billion. But we also have in the orange, the funds raised and venture capital actually invested into this category of a CTL. So that includes Hightouch, also includes a variety of other companies in this space as they evolve into composable CDP. But there's an increasing amount of activity in investments into this area. Why? It's because the growth of the data warehouse has been a huge story over the past 10 years. But then marketers and people that work in personalization, people who work in data analytics are increasingly seeing the opportunities to leverage that data through the utilization of data activation tools. And so both investment and annual revenue for some of these cloud data warehouse companies, what we're seeing is just a tremendous amount of growth. It almost feels like a gold rush. And Tejas, you can probably touch on how much Hightouch itself has grown as a company. It's incredible to see your team grow from a few people to almost 100 now, I think, and so in a very short space of time. And so it is a wonderful time with so much activity in this space and a lot of innovation as well.
Thanks for running us through that, Juan. And I agree. I mean, it's incredible to see the transition from CMOs and VPs of marketing and digital sort of only talking about the campaign level and the brand to thinking about how does data play a role in every customer interaction and journey. So now moving on to the fun part. Let's open it up and have some discussion about how the space is changing, how MarTech's changing, what the challenges, with regards to data that marketing teams are actually facing, and how those are starting to change with the data warehouse. So I'll kick it off with a kind of open-ended question here of what are the biggest challenges that marketing teams face today when it comes to working with data? And furthermore, kind of how does the data warehouse change this?
Well, I can jump in here to kick this off. I don't know. I think we've heard two complaints from marketers over the years. One is, I don't have enough data. There's always more data that marketers want to feed into their modeling, to be able to feed into personalization. And it's frustrating, particularly in the context of, third-party cookies, third-party data going away, is everyone says, oh, well, the answer to that is first-party data. Surely we have all these touch points with our customers, all these different ways. You should simply turn and use that data. To which the marketer is like, well, that sounds really fantastic, but where is that data? How do I get to that? And so I think, marketing's not been the only function inside the organization that's suffered from siloed data, and so again, this idea of having the cloud data warehouse really become the layer across the entire organization is going to start making that data accessible to marketers. Now, there's another question with that, which is much more also where you come in is, okay, it's great now that, we have all the data in the warehouse. but okay, we're not like data warehouse engineers here. Like, how do we like actually use this in our marketing applications? How do we apply that? You know, and so I think when you get the answers to both of those questions, yeah, I mean, those are the two hurdles I've seen like again and again with marketers. But
no,
Juan,
I think
you talked to a ton of folks there on this too.
I mean, I think that's spot on. I think activation is the number one challenge that I hear about in kind of my day-to-day talking to different marketing teams and growth teams around different industries. It's just, there's all this data in the organization. You know, there's been all this investment in data and analytics and warehousing and AI and ML, but it's still really hard for me to use my data to just drive a campaign. Like, why still tossing around CSVs for a simple activity like that and waiting 1 week for, you know, engineering to satisfy that Jira ticket? So, I mean, the way I see it is that the MarTech tools of the future are going to be the ones that allow the marketing team to just tap directly into that data warehouse and have a really streamlined workflow around that. And that's kind of what we're trying to create here at Hightouch, where marketers don't need to know SQL or be an engineer to tap into the data in the warehouse. And in, you know, our customer studio, they can just start building an audience visually or create an A/B test visually, et cetera, but on top of all the rich data that exists in the data warehouse. Juan, curious if you have any thoughts on other challenges that marketing teams face when it comes to data.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that, you know, as you mentioned, Scott, that, you know, marketers are always wanting data. But I actually think the ambition from the marketing department has changed over the years as well. You know, increasingly with things like experimentation, A/B testing, with complex personalization, with marketing teams being overlapping with product teams. And as technological sophistication increases, marketers are becoming more ambitious. They're asking questions like, hey, you know, we don't want to personalize things just with an email subject line. You know, we don't want to do basic content swapping based on behaviors. We want to understand the ground truth of how our customers are purchasing, how they're interacting with products, how their lifetime value has grown, how that overlaps with all of the different segmentation and behavioral that we activity we see. We also want to tap into first-party data for our advertising. You know, so I think that marketers have this growing ambition to do more complex personalization, to really drive better experiences for their customers. And the data warehouse is sitting there as this sort of pot of gold of all where so much of that rich customer data is sitting, you know. And so I think that that's one of the challenges, is that the ambition is there. Like, it's not the marketers that are saying, hey, you know, we don't want to use this data. It's actually the marketers wanting to use that even more. But the data warehousing teams or the data analytics teams struggle to integrate with that ambition. If you think about it, you know, I think there's sort of two layers of incentives there. There's the data teams that are wanting to keep things robust, keep the data managed, the data properly used and stored. And then you've got the marketing teams that are like, let's just blow this stuff up and use as much as possible. And you activate it across different channels. And I think that those teams butt heads often, particularly when it comes to data warehouse, because that is the collaborative zone for marketing data. And so, yeah, that's one of the challenges. I think the ambition kind of struggles, I think, sometimes with data analytics teams and how they see the world as well. But I'd be interested to get your view, perhaps, Tejas, if you had any customer stories that relate to that. I'm sure that you've seen a few arguments in your time.
No, 100%.
Yeah.
So we've done a lot of work in the enterprise here at Hightouch, you know, working with companies like Warner Music Group, PetSmart, even some of the fastest growing digital native brands that, you know, really are cutting edge and trying to do the most advanced things when it comes to personalization. And one thing I see time and time again, which really hits on a point that you mentioned, Juan, is that they keep buying these really sophisticated MarTech tools, like, you know, really fantastic MarTech software. Let's say something like a Salesforce Marketing Cloud and Braze, Iterable, that has all this sophisticated functionality to do the amazing, not batch first name type personalization that talked about, Juan, but journeys and putting customers through different paths based on the events those customers are taking and optimizing the best time to send the email or the best message to send and all those sorts of things. But when I actually talk to these companies in terms of how they're doing their MarTech today, a lot of them are still, you know, uploading a CSV to the system once a day, once a week, or building a pipeline that somewhat just automates that process and using these, you know, very advanced tools in a very simple way. And I find that that actually comes down to a data activation problem. The reason that companies have these huge, amazing pieces of technology, sitting on the shelf practically, is because they don't really have an easy way as a marketing team, as a digital team, to get the right data to the right tool at the right time. And that is what I'm excited about changing here with Hightouch, Customer Studio, and really putting all this wealth of data into the hands of marketers in an approachable way. But with that, let's actually move on to our next question, because it seems like we've gotten that question again a couple times in the chat here. So what is the role of the data warehouse in a world of CDPs? Are we making a new source of truth here? Should we still have a CDP? How do you all think about it as folks that have kind of been in the space for a while?
Tejas, I'll have to shout out one of your pieces, one of Hightouch's pieces last year. What was it? Friends don't let friends buy a CDP, right? We can't ignore that. That is, a big part of how you're thinking about the world in terms of the customer data platform and how it's perhaps evolving. But I think it is quite interesting, right? Because, you do have all this sophisticated tooling that sits around the data warehouse now, things like DBT that does a lot of identity resolution, and other tools that sit directly on top of the warehouse for analytics, and then data activation, that sort of audience management as well. And so you think about it, it's like, well, is this an unbundling of the CDP? Like the internet usually goes through these cycles of like technologies bundled into one thing, and then it's dispersed into a variety of things, and then that opens up choice for consumers. Then it's bundled back up, and then there's a few monoliths, right? If you think about the past 10 years from 2010 to 2020, what were the mainstream ways for centralizing data and experience? It was the Marketing Cloud. It was the Adobe Experience Cloud. You bring analytics, you bring all your channel activation, you bring all your data. And then over time, the CDP saw that as an opportunity to go, let's unbundle some of that and give marketers the ability to be able to enrich their customer segments, to identify their customers, and normalize their data and then send it out. And that's sort of taken chunks away from those sort of massive monoliths, Salesforce, Adobe's, Oracles of the world. But now we're seeing an even greater atomization beyond that. So it's like from the marketing suite to the CDP, and then now this sort of breaking apart of all these different tools that sit around the warehouse. And so I would say that, well, is a data warehouse, can it be a CDP? I've worked with some teams, very sophisticated engineering teams that, yes, they've been able to build their own instance of the customer data platform. But I'm also seeing that it's probably a different type of concept altogether, right? Like it's not just bringing like the whole idea, and, David Ravs from the CDP Institute, the way he defines a CDP is it's packaged. It's a tool that you can buy off the shelf. And increasingly, I think that what we're seeing is that teams are wanting to build their own solutions. They want to own that IP and that technology and manage it end to end, and then use the right tool set for activation and for the specific use cases. And so I think that's quite interesting, and that Hightouch plays this unique role in that holistic picture of the data warehouse, in being that tool to bring that data in and actually activate it while preserving all your identity, all your rich customer segments, all that audience enrichment within the data warehouse itself. So I think that there is a really big trend there of unbundling the customer data platform as it is. But Scott, what are your thoughts? How do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, you covered a lot of that there. One of the things I find fascinating is basically this acceleration of waves of shifts in how we think about architecture around the MarTech stack, and more broadly companies, general tech stack. I have a little bit of gray hair here. So like, I still remember the good old days when technology shifts happen in decade-long, transitions. I mean, it was literally just 8 years ago that even the concept of a CDP was like this kind of brand new idea. When David Robb first framed it, it was like, oh, well, marketers want to have this database that they control, because the data people, the IT people, won't let them play with the real database. So marketers want their own database, where they can pull their different pieces of data together and do what they want to do. Very true. Now, that quickly grew and fragmented, and boy, I mean, again, I feel like funny telling this to you from your history with Segment there too, but like there are many varieties of CDPs, and some of them, frankly, were marketing clouds under a different name, and some of them were much more focused, on like actually getting closer and closer to like this like real data infrastructure layer, but through the lens of marketing. And so because they were always in that kind of weird spectrum, I think what you are seeing here is like, okay, there are two very clear centers of gravity. There is somewhere we do actually want to get this universal data layer across the company. We can't keep having things, in all these isolated silos. We also know, like on the other end of the spectrum, when it comes to the actual engagement technologies, the functionalities we use to, like engage with customers through this multitude of channels and deliver experiences, like that's a whole world unto itself. The CDP classically was trying to like act as the bridge between that in multiple ways, both as like the, source of gravity of the data, but then also, these other tools for helping you actually manage, the variety of this data and keep it organized and, the well-structured and make sure that the flow into applications, was a stable sort of thing. And so I think what you're seeing here is exactly as you phrased it, Juan, this like unbundling where, okay, the final center of gravity for the data really is becoming the warehouse. We've got, the customer engagement tools, on the other side of the stack. And now what we're really just sort of looking at is like, what is the layer we need between these two things to really be able to optimize, how marketers still need to like manage getting the right data, organizing it the right way, make sure it's like formatted to their particular needs. Whether you want to call that a CDP or not, probably depends on how wedded your product marketing is to the term CDP. But I actually really like the way you've been framing it lately as like data activation, because I think that is the more accurate sense of like, okay, what is that unique capability that's being delivered there?
100%. Thanks for sharing your thoughts there, Scott. The way I see it is frankly, there's all this technology terms, the data warehouse, et cetera, but the two things that I see really stick out to marketing and digital teams when they see a solution that takes a bit more of a composable approach like Hightouch is one, like time to value. So as I mentioned, like I spent the first half of my career over at Segment, kind of helping create the CDP space there. And the biggest sort of failure I saw in CDP projects in terms of a marketing and digital team's ability to actually see value from those projects was really implementation, not getting all the data into the data warehouse system, into the CDP system. And if you did get all the data, that may have taken 6 months or a year to actually get it set up to get your first use case going. And over at Hightouch, kind of our philosophy is let's start with the use case and let's solve that as fast as possible. So with data activation, the idea is how do we just plug into systems that have the data today, and how do we make those available to do real-time personalization off of as fast as possible? And that's our kind of whole mentality at Hightouch. The second thing that I think really sticks out to a number of companies that we work with across retail, digitally native companies, finance, et cetera, is flexibility. I think marketers are used to living in this sort of box where they can only access data in certain ways. They can only query users or their web events or properties on users. But in reality, like customer 360, I think CDPs talk a lot about this idea of customer 360. It's not just users and events and like an account. There's, what's your balance inside of the stock market if we're like a stock trading app, or what, if we're a pet store and there's a pet sort of in the loyalty program system, what's the pet's, type of pet? What's the birthday of the pet? So we can run a birthday campaign to those pets, et cetera. There's all these other objects across every company that's sort of unique to the company that can be represented really well in the data warehouse, but struggle to be represented inside of CDPs, ESPs, and just marketing systems more broadly. And I think one of the big unlocks from using the composable CDP approach is actually putting all that data in the hands of marketers in a really easy way, where they can come into something like Customer Studio and be like, I want to find all the customers who have a pet with a birthday coming up, or I want to find all the customers that belong to a household where there is a fan of this artist, because it's likely that the rest of them are also fans in that house. And that's what I think is really exciting. It's just, putting all the power of the data and relationship and a real customer 360 that involves more than just the customer in the hands of marketing teams. So going on to our next question in the interest of time, and I think this is a spicy one, but also an important one. Marketing and data teams don't always work together. Scott, you've probably seen this. Juan, I'm sure you saw this in kind of working with various companies at Lumery. They don't always work well together. There's sometimes tension between the teams, or sometimes, a sort of blame game of where's my data? You didn't ask me for this, for a while, etc. Is that a technology problem? Is it a cultural problem? Is it both? And how do you see teams kind of facing with this and potentially overcoming it as well?
It's a big question, Tejas. But thanks for asking. I think it's a really important one, because I think that it's like most answers to these types of questions, it kind of depends. It depends on the company and the profile. But it's interesting that there is a really interesting, I think, a cultural problem between those teams. I think I touched on earlier where there's different incentive structures, so if you think about marketers, what are they chasing? They're chasing return on investment, they're chasing profitability, they're chasing growth, they're chasing conversion. They're chasing goals, and they're looking at tools and buying tools from the perspective of how's it going to grow my business. But if you look at an IT team or a data analytics team, their incentives is not that. Their incentives is actually how do we create a source of excellence? How do we streamline stuff? How do we make stuff scale? How do we ensure that things are stable? Privacy and security is a massive incentive, and so when you look at those two teams, it's not oil and water. I think those two things match so well together, because you have to grow with compliance and safety and to treat your customer data properly. But I think it's because of that shifting gears, marketers want to move really quickly. Data analytics teams are pulling up the reins and saying, hey, whoa, let's stop for a minute, But I think that's the problem, particularly in the CDP space, that I'm finding is that, and I just came back from an expo. So I was literally walking around 50, 60 different data activation CDPs and all kinds of marketing automation platforms. And, they have their lovely little booths. One of them was actually serving ice cream. I think Optimizer was serving ice cream, which is pretty cool. But anyway, what's interesting was that all the branding around the CDPs is about marketers. It's about, hey, as a marketer, you can jump in and then you can start doing all this amazing stuff with data. And there's a truth to that. And, even using some of the Hightouch tools, it's very easy for marketers to use. It's no code. You can go in, you can set up a segment, you can create an integration, you can send that data downstream. It's awesome, right? But I think the assumption, and I think this is what breaks a lot of the teams between data analytics and marketing, is their assumption that a marketer can manage all that stuff end to end. And I don't think we should be asking marketers to manage that stuff to end to end, because, often I would see that a marketer's set up a tool, or they've set up some sort of data integration, and then the data analytics team is saying, well, why'd you do it that way? And then there's a big argument that ensues. And so I think that there's a really interesting piece here, where a lot of the MarTech tools are built for marketers and not necessarily for the integration between those data analytics teams and those marketing teams as well. I think there are specific roles, and I think the forcing function of, say, Hightouch is really interesting in that it allows for that collaboration within the product itself. It's not just built for marketers. It's not just built for, say, data analytics and warehousing teams. And so that's sort of my long answer to the question. But again, it's covered under this caveat, which is it depends. I mean, every industry is so different in how they navigate data and data warehousing. But what are your thoughts, Tejas? I mean, how do you see this playing out? What are the challenges that you see on your side?
Yeah, I mean, to take a step back, we were chatting about this earlier. I think it's really an age-old problem, right? It's not a new problem with the data warehouse. It's not even a new problem with the data function. Marketers and other teams that sort of block marketing activities or assist marketing activities have always been, having some sort of tension with an organization since the beginning of time. I think IT was the old team name. Before that as engineering, but there's always some sort of collaboration between, the business team and the technical team to get the right data to the right place. But what I think is really exciting is that the number one thing that makes life difficult for the technical teams, which inevitably, I think, as you mentioned, no matter what sort of no code, CDP, et cetera, solution is purchased, if you want to run that solution on all the data in the business, you need to have a partnership with the data, an IT or an engineering team, no matter what solution you choose. And the biggest thing I see those teams struggling with is actually this concept of data silos. They're not just serving marketing, they're serving every business team around the company. And if there's a new data system they have to work with for every single business team, it's inevitable that that's kind of a nightmare for the technical folks supporting those teams. In fact, even within marketing, there might be multiple different systems that they have to support. And what I found happens with kind of an investment in a typical like traditional CDP is it almost becomes a data silo in itself. The organization is putting all this effort to centralize data in something like a data warehouse or Snowflake, Google BigQuery, Databricks, et cetera. And then the marketing team wants their own data system that needs to be structured in a certain very rigid way. And they can't even figure out how to get all the data to satisfy the marketing use cases into that system in the first place. So I think what's really exciting about this convergence of data and MarTech that I'm seeing across the industry is an opportunity to make platforms like Hightouch that bridge the gap between those two teams. And I don't think it's just, Hightouch or the problem of data activation where we're seeing this pattern. We're really seeing it across the whole marketing profession. So let me give you another example. If you think like 10 years ago, how did, a marketer actually, analyze or answer questions about their data? Marketing analytics team and marketing analytics function probably reached to a tool like Omniture or Adobe Analytics or GA to answer their questions. That still happens today, but nowadays a lot of key questions are being answered off the data warehouse through an interface like Looker or Tableau or Google Data Studio that makes it really easy for marketers to answer those questions. So I think the world of kind of marketing data is changing across the board. Activation is just one example of it that we're sort of pioneering here at Hightouch, but it's the same for analytics. It's the same for governance. It's the same for privacy and consent in a lot of ways. Scott, I'm curious if you have any other thoughts.
You guys covered so much of this. I think just one thing I would add on top is usually when you see these bottlenecks, like this was, as you pointed out, the original bottleneck between marketing and IT was the number of things marketing wanted quickly overwhelmed like the bandwidth IT could give marketing, put them in a queue. Next thing you know, everyone's like, it takes 6 months for me to get this out of IT. And so now, same thing, just mapped onto the data team. It takes 6 months for somebody in the data group to give me what I want, And so I wouldn't undersell like a lot of the power of solutions like Hightouch is while there's a configuration layer that's done in partnership, between data teams and marketing teams, as much of the actual day-to-day activities that marketers need to do, they have self-service mechanisms to do it, is one of the best ways to reduce the tension between these two teams. Anyone who ever said like IT people, don't like no-code solutions, hasn't spent a lot of time talking to IT people. IT people love no-code solutions. As long as the governance, is in a good place, the more that, business users can self-service these requests, the happier everybody is.
100%. Yeah. Go for it, Juan. Go for it.
I was just going to say, because, the end of this question is how do we fix it? And as I see, there's a few comments and questions in the chat as well, and I think that, if we look at how do you fix it, I think that a lot of this is actually based on the executive buy-in and the organizational structure. With tools like Hightouch and data warehousing, we're thinking a lot about the enterprise here. And I think that when it comes to this sort of data collaboration and bringing these two worlds together in a way that matches and not in a way that, as you mentioned, Scott, you're always tapping that person on the shoulder going, hey, when is my use case ready? When is my data ready? Always asking the questions. I think the way it works and a way I've seen it is that you take the data team and you just, instead of having a siloed IT, say data infrastructure team, or even say a CDP engineering team, instead of having those one silo in an organization, where they are working on specific enablement use cases and they've got a different stream of work, you actually distribute those resources across different verticals in your business, right? So one great example is an airline I previously worked at. They distributed their data analytics team, and so they still had a tribe that maintains the excellence across those streams, the data analytics streams of work, but they had a person sitting in each team across different verticals. So things like customer experience. Another vertical would be, say, retention. Another vertical would be just product and product management. And then what we would see is that when you have those teams that are sitting in the stand-ups and sitting in the business case planning, and you can see up front all the different things that marketing is trying to do, they can bring that knowledge back into that enablement function that sits sort of to support all the different marketing use cases. And I think when you start distributing those resources and those people, you start to see that there's a far greater alignment just across strategy and what people are trying to do, but also, it's not overwhelming just one department with a million requests, right? You got someone that's capable to pull that data for you, to bring it into, say, a data activation tool like Hightouch, but they're sitting right next to you. Some great work we just recently did with Hightouch. We went and asked a number of marketing technology leaders, how they're embracing the warehouse. And Jessica Cow, she's heads up marketing operations and analytics at F5. She says that when it comes to this stuff, she would get a data analytics person and a marketing person to sit together when they're doing analysis or when they're building a use case. They're literally side by side. And the way that works, I think, is through distributing teams. But the challenge with that is that the executive team need to recognize that this is a modern way of working, new tools, distributed teams across different business functions. That is actually pretty new, and it requires, I think, a lot of our buy-in from the top. But yeah, I'm not sure if you've seen any of that sort of ways of working that's been evolving around this, but I find that fascinating. Go away from the centralized team and then have it distributed across marketing.
100%. There'll always be a centralized team that's picking the data warehouse, figuring out how to get all the data into it, managing that core data modeling of the company, and so forth. But I think what's really exciting is this new org structure I'm seeing in a lot of companies where it's actually not new. There's always, a marketing analyst or a marketing operations person or a marketing technology person. But those folks are learning a bit more of the data side. Either they know how to write a little bit of SQL themselves to navigate to the right data model or pick the right tables in the warehouse, or they know how to work with the folks over in the data and IT team to get exactly what they need so that they can serve the rest of the business teams through something like Hightouch Customer Studio. And actually, I wanted to dial into this a bit because there's a number of questions in the chat about how does this Customer Studio thing even work? And what is a composable CDP? So thought it'd be good to actually hop back and clarify a few things to answer some of the questions in the chat. I think one of the questions is, actually, is Customer Studio another source of truth that pulls data out of the data warehouse and is its own database of sorts? The answer is no. The answer is no. Customer Studio is not another source of truth. What it actually is you tell Hightouch, as sort of a one-time step, where to look in the data warehouse for different customer attributes, customer events, entities that you want to expose, like pets or bank accounts or households or all those sorts of things I mentioned earlier with the customer examples. And then you actually get an interface that looks and feels like a marketing tool. So I think what's really exciting is that interface, looks something like this. Marketers can come in and build audiences in a visual way off the data. They can preview those audiences. They can run A/B tests and experiments. They can see where all these audiences are going and what data is flowing into them. When was the last time data was synced to them? They can see the performance of those audiences. So it's really like a full-on, experience built for marketing teams that sits directly on the data warehouse and is not a source of truth or data silo. Instead, it actually knows how to query data in the data warehouse in just the right way to expose the right information to the marketing teams. So that's just a clarification to put out there. The other thing is there's a question in the chat about how does Hightouch alleviate that dependency on the data team for the marketing team if Customer Studio is sourcing directly from the data warehouse? Yeah, so to actually implement something like Hightouch versus, let's say, a traditional CDP, in a traditional CDP, you actually need to get data into the CDP. And that is an engineering task. You actually have to reach out to, engineers who can write code, who can track events in your apps and websites and mobile apps and point of sale systems to get the information to the customer data platform so that it can become sort of a source of truth in your company. Now, with the composable CDP approach, you're actually just pulling data out of systems that already exist around the company that weren't previously servicing activation. So you're pulling data out of data warehouses and databases and data lakes that are powering BI and other initiatives around the company. And that means you actually don't need to code to use the solution or to implement the solution. There needs to be someone at your company who knows a little bit of SQL to help get the system stood up. But once it's stood up, marketers and marketing teams and marketing technologists can actually answer their questions, build their own audiences, run experiments, etc., without depending on that IT person every single time, and without any coding or changes to your applications throughout the whole lifecycle of the platform. So I think that's also a really important point to emphasize when it comes to time to value, because one thing I've seen in a lot of organizations is that it's a lot simpler to get access to someone in the company who can write a bit of SQL or build you a BI report that can now use Hightouch to set up the audience builder than it is to get access to engineers who can figure out how, a button in your app connects to the CDP and how to backfill all the data from all the systems that have been holding your, transactions for the last 10 years, et cetera. So I think that's a pretty interesting distinction between the two approaches. But keep adding questions to the chat. These are really good ones. We'll pop back in here for a second. Scott, actually, I'd be curious to get your perspective here. How will MarTech stacks change as organizations invest more in data? You've been analyzing the MarTech stacks for the last, 13 years now? So I'm sure you've seen a lot of change forever.
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, there's a number of exciting things happening, in the MarTech space, but I think one of the most exciting to me is the word you've attached in front of CDP, which is composable CDP, because this concept of composability, I think, is actually a pattern we are now seeing like spread throughout many different facets, of the tech stack. And to boil it down, it's simply a matter of saying, like, in a pre-composable world, you would buy these things that were very closed block packages. Oh yeah, here's our data warehouse package here. Here's our marketing cloud package here, and it wasn't that there was zero interaction between these things, but it was limited interaction between these things. And for the most part, people lived in this world or they lived in that world, and hey, listen, for a while, that was state of the art. It was a whole bunch of new capabilities companies have never had before. We got a lot of ground as an industry, leveraging that stuff. But increasingly, companies have gotten to the place where they don't want to adapt the way their company works to the way a piece of software was built. What they want to do is they want to adapt the software they buy to work the way they want their company to uniquely work, the way they want their customer experiences to be unique and different than their competitors' customer experiences. And it's almost then this idea of being able to have a layer above all these different technologies where you're like, oh, well, I actually can pull data from any of these different places, and I can call API services, from any of these different places. And then on top of that, I can create these like internal workflows or external customer experiences that are composed from capabilities across the entire stack. It's very important to note this is not the classic build versus buy argument, because that was often a dichotomy. It was either like, if we're going to build all of this from like the ground up, which massive undertaking, a lot of dead bodies, in the history of IT down that path. But vice versa, like the entirely buy thing was what was constraining you to like, yeah, I know this is what that software company thinks the way my business should work, but actually we have some of our own ideas of how we think our business should work. Composability is basically breaking that dichotomy and saying, listen, you can have both. Like you should absolutely buy as much of these like commercial capabilities off the shelf as you want. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. The economics of this stuff is incredibly attractive right now. But on a layer atop of that now, you want to be able to customize and tailor how not just individual pieces of the stack work, but sort of the collection of things across the stack work together. And this puts a lot of responsibility on MarTech companies. I mean, not just MarTech, but even at the data layer. I mean, it puts the responsibility on the technology vendors to support that composability. And there's also then a lot of innovation around companies that are then doing fun things with that composability on top of it. So I know I'll pick that as the one thing, but I think that relates the most to what we're talking about, right?
No, 100%. I think one clear change that we'll start to see across the MarTech ecosystem, in my opinion, is that as sort of the data warehouse, the data lakes, and these systems that the companies can truly own, where they can own their data, become the source of truth. The downstream tools, or the activation tools, won't really be seen as the source of truth anymore. So I talk to a lot of companies where they're being pitched by someone like Salesforce or Adobe or Oracle to which have great marketing platforms, by the way, but to change their whole view of data management to make Salesforce the source of truth, and put all their data in there before they can have a customer 360. I haven't chatted with one organization though which has digital assets that has done that successfully. So I think right now there's a lot of confusion in the space of like, where should that source of truth be? Where should that home for marketing data be? And I think once that gets crystallized in the market, that it's really in a data warehouse, data lake, database that you can own, the activation tools downstream will have to actually compete and get better at not being sort of a 50% good source of truth, but actually giving marketers good capabilities for activation, for personalization, for managing the customer journey. So I'm hoping that this transition and this, solve of the confusion of where that source of truth is will lead to better activation tools in the ecosystem as well. Juan, you have any thoughts here?
So I think there's an easy way to think about this, which I take a metaphor from the crypto community. So you have to bear with me for a little bit. But there's a saying in the crypto community. It says, "Not your keys, not your crypto." Which is this idea that if you don't actually own the keys, right, the phraseology that enables you to access your crypto, say if it's on an exchange, then is it really your crypto? I mean, and so it's the same concept here. If it's not your house, it's not your data. If it's sitting in, say, an instance of a CDP and their data warehouse, if it's sitting in, say, Salesforce Marketing Cloud's data warehouse, if it's sitting in Adobe's data warehouse, then how much control do you have over the actual data that's sitting in there? I would argue actually very little comparatively to the data warehouse. One story, which I think kind of coalesces a lot of this, is that a few years ago, I was working with a company, a streaming business, and their data maturity was growing really quickly, and they hired a data analytics team to really manage their data warehouse. And at that point, they invested about 2 years into their CDP. It's your typical CDP where it's stored in the CDP managed data warehouse. And when the data analytics team said, "Hey, we want to do some complex analytics work. Can we get all of those years of enriched customer data segments, all those identity stitches, all of that stuff?" They would ask for that. And then the CDP vendor would say, "That's going to be another $70,000 just to get our data, the business's data, out of the CDP into their own data warehouse." And if you think about it like that, this concept rings true. Not your house, not your data. And I think that this trend, which I think is really encouraging and really awesome, is that, teams actually want more control and mastery over their data. They want to learn the skills. They want to be able to manage and ensure that the data is compliant and safe. And they want to have full control over it, because once they have that, they have full flexibility. They don't have to be limited by, say, a Salesforce Marketing Cloud instance, or they don't have to be restrained by how a specific package product works. And that's the last thing you want to say to your customers, say, "Oh, we can't do that because our whichever tool doesn't allow us to do that. That's just not good enough today, particularly with how things are pacing out in terms of speed." So I think that's probably the big thing here, is that if it's not your house, it's not your data, and moving towards this sort of radical data ownership means that you'll have far more control and flexibility, and that transforms your entire marketing stack. So I think I think that's probably a little bit radical. But yeah, I mean, I know we're almost running up on time here, but yeah, what are your thoughts, Scott? I mean, you've probably seen this so much as well, right? It's just that the limitations of certain tools, particularly around data, it just makes it so challenging to be able to do the things you really want to do in marketing.
Yeah, I think the key, there's a couple of different layers to this, but I think one thing that almost underpins even the composability concept is just this idea of openness. Nobody wants black box situations. Nobody wants their data held hostage. Nobody wants their, like, customer experiences held hostage. I think there's going to be a wide spectrum of, it will be interesting to see how much data lives just in one place versus when we talk about the source of truth, where data gets federated in like a controlled manner for like actual activities. I think that's going to be in different places on the spectrum for different companies here for a while, but all of it only works if everything is open, and you're right that the incentives in the early days of MarTech were for like these big, massive suites to close as much as they could. It was creating switching costs. Was a strategy there, and the market just wouldn't put up with it. Part of it was that explosion of all these different MarTech tools. Is one of the things that helped trigger that, is because people wanted to be able to use these best of breed tools for different specializations. And that was one of the first limits they ran into, is if my other systems aren't open, like I can't even integrate these, So I think that is a meta movement that's happening within the industry. And then this concept of composability as like, okay, well, once things are more open, now what can I can like rethink the entire way in which I build things on top of this and activate things on top of that. Yeah, that's where I think we are now, just at the very beginning of what is going to be a fascinating another 5-10 years of innovation in this space.
And I think a clear example of that I'm starting to see is people thinking beyond the life cycle marketing or acquisition marketing, walls in a company. And they're thinking stuff like growth marketing now. How do I do things like send emails to customers first through my email marketing system, orchestrated by a central system like Customer Studio? And then if I can't engage the right customers on email, go to a paid channel to engage the really high value ones, again, orchestrated by that sort of central system that can tap into the various data systems around a company that has the context on who are the high value users. Maybe that comes from a data lake system that is being used for machine learning, or answers the question like, was the email opened by the customer that we try to target on email first, our free channel? That comes from the email system back into the data warehouse via a native connection between those tools, which exists for almost kind of every sort of modern email system at this point. I think not just openness, but also connectivity. Like, systems can be open, they can have APIs, but marketers can't code APIs, and they shouldn't need to. So I think openness is the first phase where those systems realize they can't be this locked down, source of truth. Connectivity is the next phase where they realize they has to be really easy to connect these systems together. Marketing needs a system where they can just click in and say, I want an audience to go here, I want an audience to go there. Yeah, we won't have time for all the rest of the questions in the chat, but there are some really good ones. So I wanted to share my contact information here. I made this slide really, really quick. If anyone wants to send me an email or a connection on LinkedIn, be happy to continue the conversation and loop in Juan or Scott or kind of anyone in the sort of MarTech and data community to chat more about this stuff. Anything from the questions in chat around composability or data quality or how data and marketing teams work together, to just anything across data, MarTech, or building a business. So awesome to have this session today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, that was Scott. Really fun.
Thank you, Juan, for joining.
No problem. Have a good day.
You too.
Bye, everyone.